Hello, Matthias here representing group number 7. In this presentation, I will be discussing the contemporary globe during the lifetime of English playwright William Shakespeare. Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616. 90% of people of the time were rural commoners and farmers. Most people had no connection to any other parts of the world, and yet they were far from independent. Crop failure, disease, and raids and conquests were the biggest threats to the contemporary way of life in Europe. In more populated areas like towns, the hierarchy and descending order consisted of nobility, clergymen, artisans, skilled laborers, then unskilled laborers. There was virtually no social mobility. Despite the largely agrarian focus of its people, the time period was far from devoid of creativity. A direct quote from localhistories.org says, "Britain, especially London, was the largest creative and cosmopolitan hub during the 16th and 17th century, home to many upper-class people, schools, and places for creativity. London is where Shakespeare got his start in literature." Although his time period was infamous for having very little social mobility, Shakespeare himself actually came from a new middle class. According to the Wiki for British Literature on the University of Delaware's website, a newer rung on the social ladder came to be known as the blooming middle class, comprised of about 15% of the population. The upper middle class included certain professionals and merchants. The lower middle class included artisans, shopkeepers, and tradesmen. Information from Triton.edu tells us that for many of these families on the lower half of the class spectrum, houses were usually only one room, where all activities took place, from eating, sleeping, recreation, etc. It was normally very crowded, as families had up to 5 to 6 kids because of the high infant mortality rate. It is interesting to note that even though these conditions sound pretty harsh to a modern person, Europe at the time was the biggest power in the world, being the most technologically advanced and most able to visit other parts of the world. Asia was second, which became prosperous around this time through increased trade with Europe, interested in their unique culture. A direct quote from metmuseum.org tells us that the period from 1600 to 1800 is one of increasing interaction between European traders and trade goods, and the indigenous arts and cultures of the Southeast Asian archipelago. North America, one of the largest influencers on the world stage today, was not on the board yet, as it was still in its colonization period. Africa was mostly rural and tribal, but there were certain kingdoms that prospered a lot from engaging in the slave trade. The juxtaposition between Europe's prosperity and its internal class struggle in the time period are evident in Shakespeare's works, in Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth, to name a couple. Understanding the historical context under which Shakespeare's plays were written is important to understanding their meaning overall for his audience.